And still to come on the music front, we've got something from Sanctus Real for you. But now it's time for us to say a very good morning and welcome to Mr. Michael Swain, Executive Director from Freedom of Religion, South Africa. How are you doing this morning, Michael?
Oh, doing great, Jonathan. Thanks again for having me on the show. Breakfast with Friends. Always
It's
a good
such
one.
an honor. Always good to chat to you, Michael. Really so good. So this morning I want to start at a slightly different place, and namely that with regard to if there is an accusation. So we're talking about the PEPUDA, the proposed amendments to the PEPUDA Bill. But if there is an accusation of discrimination brought under the PEPUDA, is there a way of testing its fairness? I mean, surely if your sincerely held religious convictions are the reason why you may have said or done something which might be seen to be discriminatory, this surely is sufficient justification, because the right of religious freedom is also specifically protected by Section 15 of the Constitution.
Well, you'd like to think so, wouldn't you? And that is certainly the way that we believe that it should be, because the Constitutional Court has made several judgments in which they said that there is no hierarchy of rights granted by the Constitution. In other words, one right doesn't trump another. And where two rights are perhaps in conflict, then the test that is supposed to be applied is to find, even if one does have to give way, that the maximum enjoyment and the benefit of that right still remains. It is never intended to be a winner-takes-all situation. So when we come to PEPUDA, we have a law which basically says that if you have been found to have discriminated on one of the listed grounds, then that discrimination is automatically deemed to be unfair. In other words, if you withhold a benefit or you grant somebody a benefit that you wouldn't to another, then that discrimination, once it's established, is now deemed to be unfair discrimination. And that's really what this law is supposedly protecting. It's from unfair discrimination. But then there's a test in Section 14 of this bill. And the problem with the test in Section 14 is that it effectively does establish a hierarchy of rights. So, for example, if you can show that you've been from a previously disadvantaged community, or that you've suffered some previous disadvantage, or you've lacked some benefit, and of course, there are categories that fall quite clearly into that, then effectively your right is superimposed above another right. And of course, religious freedom is very difficult to show, in fact, if not impossible, that you've somehow been a disadvantaged community. In fact, if you're a Christian, you're almost elevated into a previously advantaged category. And therefore, when it comes to some of these cases, like discrimination, like the Belofte case, you might remember, which is probably quite a good case in point, where a wedding venue owned by Christians declined with very wonderful graciousness to facilitate and to celebrate and to organize the celebration of a marriage between a same-sex couple. They didn't do so because they discriminated against LGBT people. In fact, they welcomed them to their venue. They stayed on their venue. They'd come to parties on their venue. They just said, we cannot in good conscience celebrate a marriage which we believe represents the relationship between Christ and the church. It's a sincerely held conviction of ours. We should not be forced to do something that goes against our conscience. And of course, they wouldn't celebrate, like last night, Halloween parties, for example, because that would go against their conscience. But no, Here comes the lawsuits, the South African Human Rights Commission, the other couple, and they're left back-footed because the other couple can claim, well, I'm from a previously historically disadvantaged community. I'm happy to say that case is still progressing, and we're looking, hopefully, to have it settled without actually ultimately a court judgment.
Sure, that's good news. Definitely some good news with regard to that, but it really boggles the mind, some of the thinking and the processing, hey?
And Mr. Michael, what are the main amendments that 4SA would like to see in any future draft versions of this bill?
Well, very specifically, what we are asking the Department of Justice to do, and many submissions have been made, by the way. You might recall that thanks, again, in part to CCFm, we had a tremendous response. 100,000 individual submissions were made when this bill was opened up for comment. And one of the things that we're looking is to have religious freedom rights specifically included and inserted into that fairness clause, so that it will have a much greater level of equality then put into the test. It will really balance things out properly. So that would be a big one. But also we're looking for there to be some definite protection against, for example, having to do things which the government also seems to want to do in this bill, like having to amend your constitutions to reflect their version of equity, which basically means that everybody is entitled to everything. And of course, that would pretty much mean the end of being able to have, say, a membership clause in your constitution, or to define who can be leaders and what the qualifications of leaders are. So there are certain things. I'm happy to tell you that the Department of Justice invited us to a meeting. It was about a 3-hour meeting, and we literally went through clause by clause, pointing out the concerns that we had from a religious freedom point of view. And we are certainly hoping and expectant that they listened to us. They made a very clear statement, the Deputy Minister at the end, that he said that it is not the intention of this bill to interfere with religious autonomy or doctrinal interpretation of any religious organization. And to the extent that there is a problem, they will look at ways to incorporate the concerns raised and even potentially to include specific clauses to protect the right to religious freedom in this bill. And that's a big one. I think the other thing you mentioned, Jonathan, is that PEPUDA is not just a normal piece of legislation. It is the second piece of legislation only to the Constitution. And that means that every single other piece of legislation, policy, regulation, what have you, must reflect or go through the lens of PEPUDA. And so it's a very critical piece of legislation because it effectively rewrites all others. So to get this right and to have this opportunity, we really must trust and pray and keep on pushing so that it can properly protect religious freedom rights. And that's what we're committed to do.
That is brilliant. In case you were wondering who we're chatting to, Michael Swain is the Executive Director from Freedom of Religion South Africa, and talking about the proposed amendments to the PEPUDA Bill. Very important comment that you made there towards the end, Michael. But this is where we got to wrap it up. For people who want to find out more information, want to read more, explore more, I know you've got a wonderful website. Just give us the details, please.
Yeah, our website is forsaforsa.org.za. We also have a Facebook page, Freedom of Religion SA. We have, increasingly, we're using YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, Freedom of Religion, or Forsa Freedom of Religion South Africa. So go and look at those things. Stay informed. It is so important that we are in a position when these types of legislation come out, regulations or what have you, that we understand that the sons of Issachar, they understood the times, and that we're in a position to respond. And what we found is that when we make our voices heard, when we get engaged in this democratic process that we're entitled to do, then it does make a difference. And it certainly strengthens our arm when we go in and fight for faith and freedom wherever we see it potentially eroded.
So good. Michael, thank you so much for your time this morning. Thank you for chatting to us. And we wish you and the rest of the 4SA team all of the best.
Thank you so much.